In the narrow cobbled street of Clockmaker's Row, where the air perpetually hummed with the gentle symphony of ticking timepieces, the workshop of master horologist Edmund Blackwood had fallen silent for the first time in 47 years. This silence, more profound than any sound, would have troubled those who knew the old craftsman's devotion to his art, had anyone been alive to notice it. Edmund Blackwood sat slumped over his workbench in the attitude of a man who had simply laid his head down for a moment's rest. His silver hair caught the lamplight, and his weathered hands, still steady despite his 72 years, rested beside the delicate mechanism he had been adjusting. It was only the unnatural stillness of his chest and the thin line of blood that had trickled from the corner of his mouth onto the pristine white cloth beneath his latest creation that betrayed the truth. The master clockmaker had wound his final spring. The workshop itself bore witness to a lifetime's dedication to precision and beauty. Hundreds of timepieces lined the walls, grandfather clocks with faces like solemn moons, delicate mantel clocks with cases of burled walnut and mother-of-pearl inlay, and pocket watches whose golden surfaces reflected the gaslight in tiny, dancing flames. Each piece ticked with its own rhythm, creating a complex temporal symphony that had been Edmund's constant companion through decades of solitary labor. Yet tonight, something was amiss beyond the craftsman's death. The careful order of the workshop had been disturbed. Drawers hung open, their contents of springs, gears, and precision tools scattered across the floor. Papers bearing technical drawings and correspondence lay strewn about as if someone had searched desperately for something specific. Most telling of all, the glass case that normally housed Edmund's most prized possession, the prototype of the revolutionary perpetual calendar mechanism that had made his reputation, stood empty, its lock forced and its velvet lining bearing only the impression of what had been stolen. The discovery came at precisely 9 o'clock when Iris Blackwood, the clockmaker's daughter and only child, returned from her evening walk through Regent's Park. At 28, Iris possessed her father's keen intelligence and steady hands, though she had chosen to apply these gifts to the restoration of antique timepieces rather than the creation of new ones. She had inherited her mother's dark beauty as well, with eyes the color of burnished steel, and a composure that served her well in dealing with the eccentric collectors and demanding clients who frequented their establishment. Iris's key turned in the lock of the shop's front door with its familiar click, and she called out her customary greeting, "Papa, I've brought the evening papers." The silence that answered her was not unusual. Edmund often became so absorbed in his work that he failed to hear even direct address. But as she moved, through the shop toward the workshop at the rear, a peculiar quality in the air made her pause. The symphony of ticking had a discordant note, as if several of the clocks had fallen out of synchronization. When she pushed open the workshop door and saw her father's still form, Iris's first instinct was not panic, but a strange, cold clarity that would later strike her as oddly inappropriate. She approached the workbench with careful steps, noting each detail with the same methodical precision her father had taught her to apply to the diagnosis of a faulty timepiece. The position of his body, the scattered tools, the forced lock on the display case, all these elements registered in her mind with crystalline sharpness. It was only when she placed her hand gently on her father's shoulder and felt the terrible absence of warmth that the full reality struck her. Edmund Blackwood, the man who had measured his life in precise increments and had never been late for an appointment in his adult years, had run out of time. The constable arrived within minutes of Iris's telephone call, followed shortly by Inspector Meadows of Scotland Yard, a competent if unimaginative man who had handled several cases in the neighborhood. Meadows conducted his preliminary examination with professional thoroughness, noting the signs of forced entry through the rear window, the evidence of a struggle, and the obvious motive of theft. The missing prototype alone was worth several £1,000s, and Edmund's reputation meant that any number of unscrupulous collectors might have coveted it. "A burglary gone wrong, I'm afraid, Miss Blackwood," Meadows concluded, closing his notebook with the satisfied air of a man who had solved a puzzle. "Your father likely surprised the intruder in the act. The thief panicked, struck him down, and fled with the mechanism. We'll circulate descriptions to the usual fences and pawnshops. These specialized items are difficult to dispose of quietly." But even as the inspector spoke, Iris found herself troubled by details that seemed to contradict his neat theory. Why had the intruder taken only the prototype while leaving other valuable pieces untouched? How had he known precisely which case contained the most precious item? And most puzzling of all, why had her father's own tools been used to force the lock when any competent burglar would have brought his own implements? As the evening wore on and the official investigation continued, other figures began to emerge from the shadows of Edmund Blackwood's carefully ordered life. There was Marcus Whitfield, his former apprentice, whose resentment at being dismissed 6 months earlier had been the subject of neighborhood gossip. Dr. Helena Ashford arrived in response to the summons, the family physician whose weekly visits to check Edmund's heart condition had become as regular as clockwork. James Pemberton, the antiquarian book dealer from the adjoining shop, appeared with offers of assistance and barely concealed curiosity about the circumstances of his neighbor's death. Most intriguingly, a telegram had arrived that very afternoon from one Hercule Poirot, the celebrated Belgian detective, requesting an appointment to discuss a matter of considerable delicacy related to Edmund's work. The telegram, which Iris discovered among the scattered papers, was signed with the distinctive flourish that readers of the newspapers had come to recognize, and it hinted at complexities that Inspector Meadows's straightforward theory could not accommodate. As the grandfather clock in the corner of the workshop chimed 10 o'clock, its deep voice joining the mechanical chorus that had resumed its eternal conversation, Iris Blackwood stood amid the ruins of her father's life's work and wondered what secrets had died with him. The clockmaker's daughter had inherited more than his skill with springs and gears. She had also inherited his mysteries, and she sensed that the night's revelations were only the beginning of a far more complex mechanism that someone had set in motion. The hands of time, as her father had often observed, move only forward, never back. But sometimes, Iris reflected as she watched the inspector gather his evidence, it takes a master craftsman to understand how all the pieces of a complicated timepiece work together to create the illusion of perfect order. The morning fog that shrouded Clockmaker's Row seemed to muffle not only sound, but time itself, as if the very air had grown thick with the weight of tragedy. Word of Edmund Blackwood's death had spread through the narrow street with the relentless precision of one of his own mechanisms, drawing neighbors from their shops and homes to gather in hushed clusters, their voices carrying the peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that accompanies sudden violence in a peaceful place. Mrs. Hartwell from the bakery whispered urgent theories to anyone who would listen, while the postman lingered at each doorstep, eager to share what little he knew of the clockmaker's final hours. Into this atmosphere of subdued speculation came the distinctive figure of Hercule Poirot, stepping from a hansom cab at precisely 9:30, with the careful dignity of a man who understood that first impressions, like the initial winding of a delicate timepiece, established the rhythm for everything that followed. The little Belgian detective's appearance was immaculate as always, from his patent leather shoes that reflected the gaslight to his perfectly waxed mustache that curved with mathematical precision. He paused on the cobblestones, his green eyes surveying the scene with the methodical attention of a master craftsman examining a particularly complex mechanism, noting details that others had overlooked in their haste to construct simple explanations for complicated events. Inspector Meadows, who had been expecting Poirot's arrival since discovering the telegram among Edmund's papers, greeted him with professional courtesy tinged by barely concealed irritation, preferring as he did the straightforward approach of following physical evidence to its logical conclusion rather than indulging in what he considered unnecessary psychological complications. "Monsieur Poirot," Meadows began with the tone of a man humoring an eccentric relative. I must say your timing is rather unfortunate, though the case itself is quite straightforward. A burglary turned violent when the victim surprised the intruder, with clear physical evidence and obvious motive regarding the stolen perpetual calendar mechanism. He gestured toward the broken window where morning light revealed scattered glass, marking the supposed point of entry, but Poirot's attention had already moved beyond such obvious signs to subtler details that spoke of a more complex truth. The detective's gaze lingered on the undisturbed dust along the windowsill, the precise arrangement of glass fragments, and the curious absence of muddy footprints despite the previous evening's rain. Observations that caused his eyebrows to rise with that particular expression of gentle disagreement that those familiar with his methods had learned to recognize as the prelude to revelation. "Ah, mon ami," he murmured, "but surely you have observed that this burglar, he was most considerate in his methods, non? Such attention to detail suggests not panic, but careful planning." It was then that the shop door opened to reveal Iris Blackwood, whose composed bearing, despite her obvious grief, impressed Poirot immediately. The clockmaker's daughter wore simple black that emphasized her pale complexion, her dark hair arranged with the same precision that characterized everything in her father's workshop, though the experienced detective noted the telltale signs of sleepless anguish in the slight tremor of her hands and the careful control with which she held herself. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, extending her hand with careful formality, "I received your telegram yesterday evening, though circumstances have changed considerably since you requested to see my father. There are aspects of this tragedy that I find most difficult to understand." As they examined the workshop, Poirot's methods began to distinguish themselves from conventional investigation, his attention focusing on subtleties that revealed the true character of the crime rather than its superficial appearance. He observed the methodical nature of the search conducted after Edmund's death, the specific tools scattered and those left undisturbed, and most tellingly, the manner in which the display case had been opened with instruments that could only have been wielded by someone familiar with precision mechanics. "This is not the random destruction of a panicked burglar," he explained to the increasingly uncomfortable inspector, "but the careful work of someone who knew precisely what he sought and possessed the technical knowledge to obtain it." During this examination, the key figures in Edmund's life began to present themselves, each carrying secrets that would prove crucial to understanding the clockmaker's death. Marcus Whitfield arrived first, his shoulders squared as if entering battle. The dismissed apprentice, whose professional grievances had festered into something darker during the 6 months since his departure. His eyes swept the workshop with calculating precision, lingering on the empty display case before settling on Iris with an intensity that spoke of unresolved emotions and thwarted ambitions regarding the very mechanism now missing. Dr. Helena Ashford followed, her usually composed features etched with distress that seemed to run deeper than mere professional concern for a patient's death. As Edmund's physician and confidant, she possessed intimate knowledge of his private anxieties, particularly regarding questions that had recently been raised about the perpetual calendar's true origins, knowledge that made her both valuable witness and a potential suspect in Poirot's methodical analysis. James Pemberton, the antiquarian book dealer from the adjoining shop, completed this initial gathering of suspects, his theatrical lamentations about the monstrous tragedy carrying an undercurrent of speculative interest in the market value of such a rare, now infamous, stolen artifact. His encyclopedic knowledge of collectors, both reputable and otherwise, combined with his eagerness to broker profitable deals, placed him in a unique position to have facilitated the crime either deliberately or through careless indiscretion. As Poirot observed these individuals, each representing a distinct facet of Edmund's professional and personal life, he began to perceive the intricate mechanism of human motives that had culminated in murder. The workshop, once a sanctuary of meticulous order, now felt like a stage upon which a carefully orchestrated drama was unfolding, Its players gathered behind conventional masks of sympathy and shock, while harboring secrets that would require all of his psychological insight to uncover and understand. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains of the Blackwood parlor as Hercule Poirot arranged himself with characteristic precision, transforming the modest sitting room into a theater of investigation where truth would emerge through careful observation and methodical questioning. Inspector Meadows had reluctantly withdrawn to continue his conventional inquiries below, leaving the Belgian detective to conduct his psychological examination in an atmosphere more conducive to revealing the subtle contradictions that marked guilt from innocence. Poirot's green eyes surveyed the assembled company with that peculiar intensity that made even the innocent feel exposed, while his perfectly manicured fingers adjusted his teacup with mathematical precision, each movement calculated to establish the rhythm of authority that would govern the proceedings. Iris Blackwood occupied the chair nearest the window, her pale hands folded with the same careful control that characterized everything in her grieving demeanor, though Poirot noted the slight tremor that betrayed the emotional turmoil beneath her composed exterior. When he began his inquiry, not with accusations but with gentle questions about her father's character and recent state of mind, she responded with the loyalty of a devoted daughter, describing Edmund's meticulous habits and passionate dedication to his craft. Yet as she spoke of the perpetual calendar as his magnum opus, a shadow crossed her features when she mentioned his growing anxieties about challenges to his reputation, whispered suggestions that his greatest achievement might not be entirely original. My father had become increasingly troubled in recent weeks, Iris admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Receiving letters that questioned the calendar's origins, anonymous messages that suggested someone was watching his work, waiting for an opportunity to discredit him. Poirot leaned forward with the sudden attention of a cat detecting movement, his mustache twitching as he processed this revelation, recognizing in her words the suggestion of motives far more complex than simple theft. Marcus Whitfield entered the parlor with the defensive swagger of a man prepared for battle, his broad shoulders filling the doorway as he surveyed the scene with barely concealed hostility. At 35, the former apprentice possessed the lean build and sharp features of someone who had learned to survive through cunning rather than privilege, his calloused hands gripping his cap with the tension of accumulated resentment. "I've nothing to hide about my dismissal," he declared with aggressive defensiveness. Edmund Blackwood was brilliant but impossible, demanding perfection while keeping his greatest secrets to himself, including the true methods behind that precious calendar. Poirot allowed Whitfield's bitterness to flow unchecked, observing the way his hands clenched and unclenched, the vein throbbing in his temple, and the sudden vulnerability that flickered in his eyes before being masked by renewed anger. The apprentice's grievances ran deeper than professional disappointment, carrying undertones of personal betrayal that suggested his relationship with the Blackwood family had involved more than mere employment. As Whitfield spoke of stolen ideas and stifled brilliance, Poirot noted the oil stains that darkened his cuffs in distinctive oval patterns, evidence of recent work with precision machinery that contradicted his claims of unemployment. Dr. Helena Ashford arrived with the rigid posture that betrayed her aristocratic upbringing, her silver-streaked hair arranged with clinical precision and her grey eyes reflecting the analytical mind that had made her one of London's few successful female physicians. She confirmed Edmund's fragile heart condition with professional authority, explaining that any significant shock could have proven fatal, but her composed facade flickered when Poirot inquired about the clockmaker's recent state of mind. "He was under considerable strain," she confessed reluctantly. "Not just physical, but emotional, terribly worried about whispers regarding a similar design from decades past, convinced that someone was trying to undermine his life's work." When Poirot examined her medical bag with polite interest, noting the fine French chalk used to ensure steady hands during delicate procedures, Dr. Ashford acknowledged its presence with professional dignity, though her eyes avoided direct contact when he asked about her knowledge of the calendar's intricate mechanisms. Her protective instincts regarding Edmund's reputation seemed motivated by concerns that transcended mere professional obligation, suggesting depths of relationship that she preferred to keep private. James Pemberton glided into the room with theatrical grace, somewhat muted by the gravity of the occasion, his florid features animated by the kind of excitement that tragedy brings to those who feed on drama and speculation. The antiquarian book dealer possessed that particular combination of erudition and avarice that marked the successful middleman, his extensive knowledge of rare objects matched by his understanding of collectors willing to pay premium prices for items of questionable provenance. "A tragedy for all of Clockmaker's Row," he proclaimed with elaborate flourish, though I must say Edmund had become increasingly secretive about his work, particularly concerned about a certain collector known for acquiring rare patents through less than scrupulous means. As Pemberton spoke of mysterious clients and whispered threats, Poirot observed the way his eyes repeatedly returned to the empty space where the calendar had hung, the slight smear of beeswax on his sleeve suggesting recent handling of antique furniture or artifacts. The book dealer's eagerness to discuss the calendar's questionable origins hinted at knowledge that could only have come from intimate involvement in the shadowy world of collectors and forgers that existed on the margins of legitimate trade. Through these careful interviews, Poirot began to perceive the intricate mechanism of human motivation that had culminated in murder. Recognizing that Edmund Blackwood's workshop had been more than a place of business, but the center of a web of relationships complicated by ambition, desire, and secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. The little Belgian detective settled back in his chair with the satisfaction of a craftsman who had identified crucial flaws in an otherwise perfect design, knowing that patience and precision would eventually reveal the truth hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. The afternoon light filtered through the workshop's dusty windows as Hercule Poirot conducted his methodical re-examination of the crime scene, his trained eye detecting subtleties that Inspector Meadows had dismissed in his eagerness to construct a simple narrative from complex evidence. The little Belgian detective moved with the precision of a master craftsman, noting the undisturbed dust along the windowsill despite the supposed point of entry, the curious pattern of glass fragments that had fallen inward rather than outward, and most tellingly, the faint smear of beeswax on the display case's forced lock that spoke of careful preparation rather than panicked desperation. Each detail contributed to a growing conviction that Edmund Blackwood's murder had been orchestrated by someone intimately familiar with both the workshop's layout and the clockmaker's most precious secrets. Inspector Meadows arrived with barely concealed triumph, clutching evidence that he believed would close the case definitively. A specialized watchmaker's file bearing the distinctive initials M.W. had been discovered in the alleyway behind the shop, while Mrs. Higgins from down the street had provided testimony, placing a figure matching Marcus Whitfield's description near the workshop during the crucial evening hours. "The pieces fit together perfectly, Monsieur Poirot," Meadows declared with satisfaction. "Motive, opportunity, means, and physical evidence, all pointing to the dismissed apprentice whose resentment finally boiled over into violence." Yet Poirot's response carried that gentle skepticism that those familiar with his methods had learned to recognize as the prelude to deeper revelation. The file's placement seemed almost theatrical in its obviousness, while the witness's account lacked the precise details that would elevate it beyond mere circumstantial suspicion. More significantly, the crime's execution displayed a technical sophistication and psychological calculation that seemed inconsistent with the impulsive violence suggested by the conventional theory. "Ah, mon ami," Poirot murmured, examining the tool with his magnifying glass. "But consider the mentality required for such meticulous planning, the intimate knowledge of the victim's habits and vulnerabilities, the specific targeting of the perpetual calendar. While more accessible, valuables remained untouched." The interrogation of Marcus Whitfield in the workshop itself proved particularly revealing, not for what it confirmed, but for what it contradicted about the official theory. Standing among the scattered tools and overturned drawers, the former apprentice's genuine distress became apparent beneath his defensive bravado, his familiarity with the space manifesting in unconscious gestures of professional habit rather than criminal calculation. When confronted with the file, Whitfield's explanation of its loss weeks earlier carried the ring of truth, supported by his landlord's testimony about repairs to a jammed cellar door that had required precisely such a specialized tool. Poirot's attention shifted to the missing correspondence that Iris had discovered among her father's papers, bundles of letters tied with blue ribbon that had been methodically searched, leaving telltale gaps where specific documents had been removed. The remaining missives, signed only with the initial A, revealed a campaign of psychological warfare designed to undermine Edmund's confidence in his greatest achievement, suggesting motives far more sophisticated than simple theft or revenge. These letters speak of intellectual jealousy, Poirot observed to Iris, the work of someone who understood not only the calendar's technical specifications, but its emotional significance to your father. Dr. Helena Ashford's arrival provided another layer of complexity to the investigation, her medical expertise offering insights into Edmund's declining health, while her obvious emotional investment suggested relationships that transcended mere professional obligation. Under gentle questioning, she acknowledged the clockmaker's growing paranoia about challenges to his reputation, his increasing reliance on her evening visits for both medical monitoring and personal reassurance. The doctor's protective instincts became apparent when she attempted to deflect inquiries about Edmund's private correspondence, claiming patient confidentiality even after death, though her reluctance seemed motivated by loyalty to secrets she had sworn to protect rather than professional ethics. James Pemberton's involvement emerged through his own nervous attempts to distance himself from any connection to the theft, his theatrical protestations undermined by obvious knowledge of details that had not been made public. The antiquarian book dealer's role as intermediary between Edmund and a mysterious collector became clear through persistent questioning, revealing his provision of detailed information about the calendar's location and security arrangements to facilitate what he had expected to be a legitimate sale. His mounting debts and desperate need for commission created compelling motivation for betrayal, while his access to the workshop through neighborly visits had provided opportunity for reconnaissance and preparation. As the afternoon progressed, Poirot began to perceive the intricate mechanism of human relationships that had made Edmund Blackwood's workshop a crucible of competing interests and hidden agendas. Each suspect possessed both motive and opportunity, their individual actions contributing to circumstances that had made murder not only possible, but perhaps inevitable. The dismissed apprentice's continued access through Iris's sympathetic intervention, the doctor's intimate knowledge of Edmund's vulnerabilities, the book dealer's commercial exploitation of the clockmaker's reputation, all combined to create perfect conditions for tragedy. Yet beneath these surface motivations, Poirot detected deeper currents of deception that suggested the truth remained hidden behind carefully constructed facades. The little detective settled among the ticking clocks with the patience of a craftsman who had identified crucial flaws in an otherwise perfect design, knowing that time itself would eventually reveal which of these carefully guarded secrets had provided both motive and opportunity for murder, and recognizing that the most dangerous game was yet to be played. The gaslight flickered against the evening fog as Inspector Meadows arrived at the Blackwood workshop with the satisfied bearing of a man whose investigation had reached its inevitable conclusion, leading Marcus Whitfield in handcuffs, while a small crowd of neighbors gathered to witness what they believed to be justice finally served. The evidence against the former apprentice seemed overwhelming in its completeness. A specialized watchmaker's file bearing his distinctive initials, discovered in the alleyway behind the shop, testimony from Mrs. Higgins placing a figure matching his description near the workshop during the crucial evening hours, and most damning of all, a small velvet pouch found sewn into the lining of his overcoat, containing fragments of the stolen perpetual calendar, including a distinctive moon disc bearing Edmund's maker's mark and a jeweled pivot that could only have come from the missing mechanism. Meadows laid out these items on Edmund's workbench with ceremonial precision, each piece of evidence supporting the others in what appeared to be an unassailable case of murder motivated by professional jealousy and personal resentment, while Whitfield's protests of innocence carried the hollow ring that guilt often produces when confronted with irrefutable proof. Yet Hercule Poirot observed these proceedings with the troubled expression of a master craftsman who had detected fundamental flaws in an apparently perfect mechanism, his green eyes reflecting deep dissatisfaction with explanations that satisfied conventional logic, while ignoring psychological realities that spoke of far more complex truths. The little Belgian detective had spent hours examining each piece of evidence with his characteristic precision, noting subtle inconsistencies that suggested deliberate manipulation rather than authentic discovery. The file's placement in the alleyway displayed theatrical obviousness designed to direct suspicion. The velvet pouch bore traces of lavender that seemed inconsistent with Whitfield's Spartan lodgings, and most tellingly, the calendar fragments showed signs of careful handling rather than the damage one would expect from a panicked struggle and hasty concealment. As the police wagon disappeared into the London fog, Poirot found himself alone with Iris Blackwood in the workshop where her father had died, the ticking of hundreds of clocks creating a temporal symphony that seemed to mock the crude attempts at justice being conducted in the name of her murdered parent. Through gentle questioning, the detective uncovered depths of relationship that had been overlooked in the rush to judgment, particularly the romantic attachment that had developed between Iris and Marcus during his years of employment. A connection that had contributed to Edmund's decision to dismiss him when professional boundaries became blurred by personal emotions, and that now provided compelling motivation for the young woman's fierce defense of his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. The interrogation at Scotland Yard had revealed Whitfield's genuine terror at being accused, but Poirot's experienced eye detected the difference between the fear of injustice and the panic of exposure, noting that the young man's distress seemed to stem from bewilderment at the evidence against him rather than anxiety about his crimes being discovered. Whitfield's explanation of his presence near the workshop that evening, though convenient for the prosecution's timeline, carried psychological authenticity in its very awkwardness. He had indeed intended to confront Edmund about overdue payment for past work, had found the rear window mysteriously ajar, and had entered to discover the clockmaker already dead, fleeing in panic when he realized how his presence would be interpreted by authorities already predisposed to suspect him. This account, while self-serving, aligned with Poirot's growing conviction that Edmund Blackwood's murder had been orchestrated by someone who understood not only the technical aspects of his work but the psychological pressures that had made him increasingly vulnerable to manipulation. Someone who possessed the sophistication to conduct the systematic campaign of anonymous letters that had undermined the clockmaker's confidence in his greatest achievement, while simultaneously positioning a convenient scapegoat to bear responsibility for the crime. The missing correspondence, those mysterious missives signed only with the initial A, displayed a level of psychological warfare that seemed far beyond Whitfield's demonstrated capacity for subtle malice. Their technical terminology and intimate knowledge of Edmund's vulnerabilities, suggesting an author with advanced horological expertise and patient cunning. Dr. Helena Ashford's obvious emotional investment in protecting Edmund's reputation continued to intrigue Poirot, her medical expertise providing perfect cover for intimate knowledge of the clockmaker's declining health and increasing paranoia, while her access to precision instruments and cleaning compounds suggested capabilities that transcended mere professional consultation. James Pemberton's role as facilitator between Edmund and mysterious collectors had created a web of financial pressure and commercial betrayal that made him uniquely positioned to orchestrate the theft, his mounting debts providing compelling motivation for betraying his neighbor's trust, while his antiquarian expertise gave him the knowledge necessary to appreciate the calendar's true value and identify potential buyers willing to overlook questions of provenance. As night settled over Clockmaker's Row, Poirot began to perceive the true mechanism that had driven events toward their tragic conclusion. Recognizing that the theft of the perpetual calendar had been carefully constructed misdirection designed to conceal deeper truths about relationships, rivalries, and secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. The little detective settled among the ticking clocks with the patience of a craftsman who had identified the crucial flaw in an otherwise perfect design. His conviction that Marcus Whitfield was innocent, creating an urgent obligation to uncover the real killer before judicial machinery, ground forward to its irreversible conclusion, while his growing understanding of the psychological complexities involved suggested that the most dangerous revelations were yet to come. The arrest of Marcus Whitfield had brought a deceptive calm to Clockmaker's Row, but Hercule Poirot found himself deeply troubled by the neat resolution that satisfied Inspector Meadows while leaving crucial questions unanswered. The little Belgian detective understood that the most dangerous criminals were those who possessed the sophistication to manipulate not only evidence, but the very psychology of investigation itself, creating false narratives that appealed to conventional logic, while concealing far more complex truths. As he stood in Edmund Blackwood's workshop the morning after the arrest, surrounded by the gentle symphony of ticking clocks, Poirot made a decision that would transform his inquiry from passive observation into active psychological warfare against a killer who believed themselves safely hidden behind their carefully constructed deception. With characteristic precision, Poirot began to prepare what he privately termed his laboratory of human nature, arranging subtle tests that would reveal the true character of each suspect through their unconscious responses to carefully orchestrated stimuli. He adjusted a ship's chronometer in the window display by exactly 37 seconds, a deviation that would be instantly apparent to any trained horologist but invisible to casual observers, then deliberately reversed a tiny click spring in a half-assembled carriage clock on the workbench, creating a fault that spoke of intimate technical knowledge to those capable of recognizing it. Most significantly, he placed upon the work table a sealed envelope addressed in bold script to Edmund Blackwood, bearing only the initial A on its flap, though the page within remained blank since its psychological impact mattered far more than any actual content it might contain. The responses of each suspect to these carefully placed provocations proved more revealing than hours of conventional interrogation could have achieved. Iris Blackwood, summoned first under the pretext of assisting with inventory, moved through the workshop with unconscious familiarity, her hand reaching automatically to correct the chronometer's deviation before she realized what she had done, her embarrassment at this betrayal of lifelong habit speaking to innocence rather than guilt. When her gaze fell upon the reversed spring, she hesitated with the restraint of someone who recognized deliberate arrangement and chose not to interfere, while the mysterious envelope drew only puzzled curiosity rather than the recognition or fear that guilt would have produced. Dr. Helena Ashford's arrival brought a different quality of tension to the proceedings, her medical training evident in the way she stood motionless with hands clasped, observing rather than touching. Yet when the faulty carriage clock struggled against its deliberately imposed impediment, she took one involuntary step forward before restraining herself with professional discipline. Her reaction to the envelope proved most illuminating, her gaze fixing upon it with the proprietary concern of someone who recognized its significance, though her theatrical aversion of eyes suggested knowledge she preferred to keep hidden rather than guilt she feared to reveal. James Pemberton's entrance brought theatrical energy barely contained by the solemnity of the occasion, his attention drawn immediately to the empty display case with lamentations that mixed genuine distress with calculating assessment of commercial implications. The envelope commanded his greedy curiosity despite his attempts to disguise this interest as mere solicitude, while his fastidious reaction to the lavender-scented chamois cloth on the workbench suggested familiarity with more refined environments than his current circumstances would indicate. the response of a man whose tastes exceeded his legitimate means of satisfying them. As the afternoon progressed, Poirot's gentle questioning began to reveal the complex web of relationships and hidden knowledge that had made Edmund Blackwood's workshop a crucible of competing interests and dangerous secrets. Through seemingly casual conversation, he learned that Iris had recently discovered a hidden compartment in her father's desk, concealed behind a mechanism that required precise manipulation of 3 tiny levers in sequence, revealing correspondence that cast troubling shadows over Edmund's reputation and suggested that his celebrated perpetual calendar had been based upon designs originally created by another craftsman, whose work had been lost in circumstances that remained deliberately vague. This revelation struck Poirot with the force of recognition, the anonymous letters signed with the initial A, suddenly acquiring new significance as he understood that someone connected to the original designer had discovered Edmund's deception and begun the systematic campaign of psychological warfare that had culminated in murder. The theft of the calendar had been motivated not by simple greed, but by a desire for justice or revenge that transcended monetary considerations, speaking to deeper questions of intellectual property and professional honor that plagued the competitive world of precision craftsmanship where individual genius commanded both reverence and envy. Dr. Ashford's composed facade showed subtle cracks when confronted with these revelations, her protective instincts regarding Edmund's reputation acquiring new dimensions as she acknowledged having known about the calendar's questionable origins for several years, the clockmaker having confessed his deception during episodes of cardiac distress, when the burden of maintaining his fraudulent reputation had begun to exact a physical toll that threatened both his health and his sanity. Her medical expertise had made her uniquely positioned to understand the psychological pressure that Edmund endured, while her aristocratic connections provided access to the shadowy world, where stolen intellectual property was transformed into legitimate commercial transactions. Pemberton's role as facilitator between Edmund and mysterious collectors acquired sinister new significance in light of these discoveries, his antiquarian expertise making him perfectly positioned to understand the historical context of the stolen designs, while his mounting debts provided compelling motivation for exploiting Edmund's vulnerability through blackmail or coercion. The book dealer's theatrical protestations of innocence seemed calculated to deflect attention from his intimate knowledge of the workshop's security arrangements and his ability to identify potential buyers willing to overlook questions of provenance in exchange for acquiring genuinely revolutionary mechanisms. As evening settled over Clockmaker's Row, Poirot began to perceive the true mechanism that had driven events toward their tragic conclusion. Understanding that the murder of Edmund Blackwood had been orchestrated by someone who possessed not only technical expertise and historical knowledge, but the psychological sophistication to conduct a campaign of intellectual terrorism that had ultimately proved fatal. The little detective settled among the ticking clocks with the patience of a master craftsman who had identified the crucial flaw in an otherwise perfect design, his conviction that the real killer remained at large, creating urgent obligation to expose the truth before judicial machinery proceeded to its irreversible conclusion. While his growing understanding of the psychological complexities involved suggested that the most dangerous revelations were yet to come in this intricate game of minds that had already claimed one life and threatened to claim another. The evening mist that settled over Clockmaker's Row carried with it an oppressive quality that seemed to muffle even the eternal symphony of ticking timepieces, as if the very air had grown thick with secrets that demanded revelation. Hercule Poirot stood at the window of Edmund Blackwood's workshop, his green eyes reflecting the gaslight as he contemplated the delicate psychological mechanism he had set in motion earlier that day, knowing that truth, like the most precise clockwork, required careful calibration before it could function properly. The little Belgian detective had spent hours preparing what he privately termed his experiment in human nature. Placing subtle indicators throughout the workshop, that would reveal the true character of each suspect through their unconscious responses to carefully orchestrated stimuli, understanding that the most dangerous criminals were those who possessed sufficient sophistication to manipulate not only evidence, but the very psychology of investigation itself. The bait he had prepared was elegantly simple yet psychologically complex. A sealed envelope bearing Edmund's name, and marked with the distinctive initial A, placed prominently upon the workbench where anyone entering the workshop could not fail to notice it, though the page within remained blank, since its psychological impact mattered far more than any actual content it might contain. Additionally, he had made subtle adjustments to several timepieces, creating deliberate imperfections that would be instantly apparent to any trained horologist but invisible to casual observers, each modification designed to provoke specific responses that would reveal technical knowledge, emotional investment, or guilty recognition in whoever encountered them. The trap was sprung at precisely 9:15 when James Pemberton's anguished cry pierced the fog-shrouded silence of the narrow street, drawing Poirot and Inspector Meadows rushing toward the antiquarian bookshop, where they discovered the dealer collapsed among his precious volumes, his florid features bearing the terrible pallor of death. The scene presented itself as a tragic accident. Pemberton lay beneath a heavy oak bookshelf whose brackets had given way, spilling leather-bound manuscripts and ledgers across his prostrate form, while a toppled step-stool suggested he had overreached for some high-placed treasure and brought disaster upon himself through careless ambition. Yet Poirot's trained eye immediately detected the subtle inconsistencies that transformed apparent accident into deliberate murder, his methodical examination revealing evidence of careful preparation rather than random misfortune. The shelf's brackets bore traces of beeswax that had been applied to soften their resistance, ensuring that minimal pressure would cause catastrophic failure, while the positioning of the step stool showed clear signs of having been moved after the collapse, its feet resting in darker scuffs that contradicted the pale squares of undisturbed dust where it had previously stood for months. Most tellingly, the manuscript clutched in Pemberton's left hand bore the distinctive wear patterns of right-handed use, making it impossible for him to have reached for it naturally, while the gas lamp had been deliberately dimmed to conceal the killer's preparations. Dr. Helena Ashford's arrival brought additional complexity to the investigation, her medical expertise confirming that Pemberton's injuries were consistent with the bookshelf's impact, yet her obvious emotional distress seemed to transcend mere professional concern for a neighbor's death. Under gentle questioning, she acknowledged having visited Pemberton earlier that evening to discuss matters related to Edmund's estate, though her reluctance to elaborate suggested conversations that had ranged far beyond simple medical consultation. The physician's protective instincts regarding Edmund's reputation acquired new significance when Poirot discovered among the scattered papers correspondence that revealed Pemberton's role as intermediary between the clockmaker and mysterious collectors, particularly someone identified only as A. Ashworth, whose extensive knowledge of horological history had made him both valuable client and dangerous adversary. The discovery of the decoy envelope in Pemberton's pocket, creased as if clenched in desperate fingers, confirmed that the book dealer had taken the bait, though whether from guilt, fear, or opportunistic calculation remained unclear. His systematic search through Edmund's correspondence, conducted in the hours before his death, suggested someone seeking specific documents that could either incriminate or exonerate him in the growing investigation, while the deliberate destruction of certain papers in his fireplace spoke of secrets he had been determined to protect, even at the cost of his own life. Iris Blackwood's testimony proved crucial in establishing the timeline of events. Her observation of unusual activity around Pemberton's shop during the previous evening, confirming that the book dealer had received visitors whose refined appearance and expensive clothing suggested aristocratic connections. These mysterious callers had seemed more interested in examining private correspondence than purchasing rare manuscripts, their behavior suggesting familiarity with Pemberton's role in facilitating questionable transactions involving precision timepieces and their disputed provenance. As the investigation progressed, Poirot began to perceive the intricate mechanism of relationships and hidden loyalties that had transformed Clockmaker's Row into a battlefield where questions of intellectual property and professional honor had escalated into matters of life and death. The systematic campaign of anonymous letters that had undermined Edmund's confidence in his greatest achievement had been orchestrated by someone with both historical knowledge and personal investment in exposing the truth, while Pemberton's murder had been necessitated by his decision to reveal information that threatened to expose the entire network of deception and complicity that had sustained the clockmaker's fraudulent reputation. The identity of the mysterious A. Ashworth began to emerge through careful analysis of the surviving correspondence, revealing a pattern of communication that suggested not merely commercial interest, but personal vendetta against those who had profited from stolen designs. Dr. Ashford's increasing agitation when confronted with these revelations indicated knowledge she had been desperate to protect, her aristocratic connections providing access to the shadowy world where stolen intellectual property was transformed into legitimate commercial ventures, while her medical expertise had made her uniquely positioned to understand both Edmund's psychological vulnerabilities and the methods necessary to exploit them. As midnight approached and the fog thickened around the crime scene, Poirot settled among the scattered manuscripts with the grim satisfaction of a craftsman who had finally identified the crucial flaw in an apparently perfect mechanism, his understanding of the psychological forces at work creating both opportunity and obligation to expose the truth before the killer could eliminate additional witnesses to their carefully orchestrated campaign of justice that had transformed into something far more sinister and dangerous than simple revenge. The little detective knew that time was running short, and that the most perilous phase of his investigation was yet to come. The pale dawn light that crept through the grimy windows of Edmund Blackwood's workshop found Hercule Poirot in a state of profound concentration, his usually immaculate appearance showing subtle signs of the sleepless night he had spent unraveling the complex mechanism of deception that had claimed 2 lives in Clockmaker's Row. The little Belgian detective sat surrounded by scattered evidence, each piece carefully arranged with mathematical precision on the workbench where the master clockmaker had died, while the eternal symphony of ticking timepieces provided a temporal backdrop to his methodical analysis of the psychological and physical elements that had transformed a quiet street into a battlefield of hidden vengeances and stolen legacies. Inspector Meadows had retired hours earlier, with the satisfied conviction that Marcus Whitfield's arrest had solved the Blackwood murder, while Pemberton's death represented nothing more than a tragic accident. But Poirot's trained eye had detected the subtle inconsistencies that spoke of careful orchestration rather than random misfortune, recognizing in the pattern of events the signature of a mind capable of extraordinary patience and cunning. The breakthrough came through Poirot's meticulous examination of the evidence that had condemned Whitfield, particularly the fragments of the perpetual calendar mechanism found sewn into the young man's overcoat, which, upon careful analysis, revealed technical flaws that no competent horologist would have tolerated in their work. Using Edmund's own precision instruments, Poirot measured the moon disk's diameter and tooth profile against the original specifications, discovering that the 31 teeth displayed a pressure angle that would bind any companion pinion, while the jeweled pivot bore lithe chatter marks that Edmund's steady hand would never have produced. When placed upon the velvet impression cut for the true prototype, the disc rocked imperceptibly, betraying its false parentage and confirming that someone with access to the workshop but limited technical expertise had created these components specifically to incriminate Whitfield. Understanding that their obvious connection to the missing calendar would satisfy conventional investigation while concealing the true motive behind the clockmaker's murder. This discovery led Poirot to re-examine the anonymous letters that had tormented Edmund in his final weeks. those insidious missives signed only with the initial A that had systematically undermined the clockmaker's confidence in his greatest achievement through a campaign of psychological warfare more sophisticated than any physical assault. Reading them again with fresh understanding, the detective perceived that their technical terminology, while seemingly horological in nature, carried an underlying clinical detachment characteristic of someone accustomed to diagnosing human frailties with scientific precision. Their references to pathological degradation and systemic failure of ethical mechanisms, revealing a medical mind cloaked in mechanical metaphor. The precision of their psychological targeting, combined with intimate knowledge of Edmund's vulnerabilities and cardiac condition, suggested an author who possessed both the expertise to conduct such systematic mental torture and the opportunity to monitor its effects through regular personal contact. The connection to Dr. Helena Ashford crystallized through a seemingly insignificant detail that had escaped Inspector Meadows's conventional investigation. The presence of fine French chalk residue on wrapping paper found in Pemberton's shop, matching the distinctive shimmer of the specialized powder the physician used to ensure steady hands during delicate procedures. This physical evidence, combined with the watermarked stationery bearing the partial letters ASAGUW discovered in her consulting rooms, established not only her presence at both crime scenes, but her connection to the mysterious A. Ashworth, whose name had appeared in Pemberton's correspondence with collectors of disputed horological artifacts. The revelation that Helena's maiden name had been Ashworth, inherited from her grandfather Augustus, who had died in poverty and obscurity while his revolutionary perpetual calendar design brought fame and fortune to the man who had stolen it during an apprenticeship in Vienna decades earlier, provided the generational motive that had driven her systematic campaign of retribution against those who had profited from her family's genius. The scope of Helena's deception became apparent as Poirot pieced together the elaborate network she had constructed to restore her grandfather's reputation while destroying Edmund's peace of mind, her aristocratic connections and medical credentials, providing perfect cover for the patient cultivation of relationships that had given her intimate access to the clockmaker's workshop and psychological vulnerabilities. Her weekly medical visits had allowed her to monitor Edmund's declining mental state with scientific precision, calibrating the pressure of her anonymous correspondence to exploit his cardiac condition while maintaining the facade of concerned physician attending a deteriorating patient. The discovery of Augustus Ashworth's original 1896 sketches in Edmund's hidden compartment, their existence known only to those who had earned the clockmaker's desperate trust during moments of cardiac distress, confirmed that Helena had possessed both the motive and the means to orchestrate the theft that would simultaneously recover her grandfather's stolen legacy and eliminate the evidence of Edmund's lifelong deception. Pemberton's murder had been necessitated by his decision to reveal the true scope of the conspiracy to the authorities, his mounting debts and fear of prosecution making him willing to betray his aristocratic clients in exchange for leniency, while his systematic search through Edmund's correspondence had been conducted not to find incriminating evidence, but to locate the original technical specifications that would complete Augustus Ashworth's vindication. Helena's medical expertise had provided her with both the knowledge and the tools necessary to weaken the bookshelf brackets with precisely applied beeswax, ensuring catastrophic failure at the crucial moment while her professional credentials and genteel demeanor had placed her above suspicion in the eyes of conventional investigation. The planted evidence that had condemned Whitfield revealed her sophisticated understanding of criminal psychology. Her access to the young man's lodgings through Iris's well-meaning attempts to maintain contact with her former suitor, providing the opportunity to sew incriminating fragments into his overcoat, while her medical training had taught her the importance of physical proof in establishing guilt beyond reasonable doubt. As the morning light strengthened and the workshop's mechanical symphony resumed its eternal conversation, Poirot began to perceive the full scope of Helena Ashford's campaign against those she held responsible for her grandfather's betrayal. recognizing that Edmund's death had been merely the beginning of a systematic program of retribution that would have eventually claimed other victims who had profited from Augustus Ashworth's stolen genius. The doctor's patient cultivation of relationships within Clockmaker's Row had provided her with intimate knowledge of each resident's vulnerabilities and secrets, while her aristocratic breeding and professional standing had made her prosecution extraordinarily difficult without overwhelming evidence of her guilt. The little detective settled back among the ticking clocks with the grim satisfaction of a craftsman who had finally identified the crucial flaw in an apparently perfect mechanism. His understanding of the psychological forces at work, creating both the obligation to expose the truth and the recognition that the most dangerous phase of his investigation was about to begin, as he prepared to confront a killer whose sophistication and social position made her far more formidable than any common criminal he had previously encountered. The amber gaslight cast long shadows across Edmund Blackwood's workshop as Hercule Poirot arranged the final pieces of his investigation with the methodical precision that had made him legendary throughout Europe, transforming the cluttered space where two murders had been conceived into an elegant theater where truth would finally emerge from beneath layers of carefully constructed deception. Inspector Meadows stood near the doorway with barely concealed skepticism, still convinced that Marcus Whitfield's arrest had solved the case despite the Belgian detective's persistent objections, while Iris Blackwood occupied her father's chair behind the workbench with pale composure that masked the terrible realization that someone she had trusted had orchestrated her parents' destruction. Dr. Helena Ashford entered last, her aristocratic bearing intact despite the mounting pressure of Poirot's investigation, her steel-grey eyes surveying the assembled company with the clinical detachment that had served her so well throughout her campaign of systematic revenge, though the little detective noted the almost imperceptible tremor in her gloved hands as she settled into the chair he had positioned with calculated precision. The workshop itself bore witness to Poirot's meticulous preparation, each piece of evidence arranged upon the central workbench with mathematical exactitude to create a visual timeline of deception that would guide his exposition through the complex mechanism of motive and method that had culminated in murder. The forged calendar fragments that had condemned an innocent man gleamed under the lamplight beside technical drawings that revealed their fraudulent nature, while the anonymous letters signed with the mysterious initial A lay spread in chronological order to demonstrate the systematic psychological warfare that had driven Edmund Blackwood to his death. Most significantly, a sealed envelope bearing the distinctive watermark of expensive stationery occupied the center of this arrangement, its presence creating an atmosphere of expectation that made even the innocent feel exposed to scrutiny. Poirot began his exposition with characteristic courtesy, his green eyes reflecting the satisfaction of a master craftsman who had finally assembled all components of an extraordinarily complex puzzle. "Mesdames et messieurs," he announced with formal precision, "we gather this evening not merely to discuss the tragic deaths that have shaken Clockmaker's Row, but to examine the intricate machinery of justice and revenge that has operated in shadows for many months, driven by grievances that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances of these crimes." His methodical analysis of the planted evidence revealed the sophisticated mind behind the deception, particularly the calendar fragments whose technical flaws would have been immediately apparent to any competent horologist, yet had satisfied conventional investigation through their obvious connection to the missing prototype. The breakthrough had come through Poirot's careful examinations of the moon disk found in Whitfield's possession, which under precise measurement revealed a pressure angle that would bind any companion pinion and lathe chatter marks that Edmund's steady hand would never have produced. "This disk," he explained with gentle authority, "when placed upon the velvet impression cut for the true prototype, rocks imperceptibly, betraying its false parentage and confirming that someone with access to the workshop but limited technical expertise created these components specifically to incriminate young Whitfield. The revelation that the specialized file bearing Whitfield's initials had been deliberately placed, combined with witness testimony that proved conveniently malleable under careful scrutiny, demonstrated the elaborate misdirection that had satisfied Inspector Meadows while concealing far more complex truths. Dr. Ashford's composed facade showed its first crack when Poirot produced the watermarked stationery bearing the partial letters H.G. Tubabius that connected her to the mysterious collector whose extensive knowledge of horological history had made him both valuable client and dangerous adversary to those who trafficked in disputed timepieces. The detective's revelation that her maiden name had been Ashworth, inherited from her grandfather Augustus, who had died in poverty while his revolutionary perpetual calendar design brought fame and fortune to Edmund Blackwood, provided the generational motive that had driven her systematic campaign of retribution across decades of patient preparation. Her weekly medical visits had allowed her to monitor the clockmaker's declining mental state with scientific precision, calibrating the pressure of her anonymous correspondence to exploit his cardiac condition while maintaining the facade of concerned physician attending a deteriorating patient. The scope of Helena's deception became apparent as Poirot methodically reconstructed her elaborate network of relationships and false identities, her aristocratic connections and medical credentials, providing perfect cover for the cultivation of trust that had given her intimate access to Edmund's workshop and psychological vulnerabilities. The anonymous letters that had tormented the clockmaker in his final weeks revealed themselves as products of a medical mind cloaked in mechanical metaphor, their references to pathological degradation and systemic failure of ethical mechanisms, betraying the clinical detachment of someone accustomed to diagnosing human frailties with scientific precision. The discovery of Augustus Ashworth's original technical specifications, hidden in Edmund's secret compartment, and known only to those who had earned his desperate trust during moments of cardiac distress, confirmed that Helena had possessed both the historical knowledge and emotional investment necessary to orchestrate the theft that would simultaneously recover her grandfather's stolen legacy and eliminate evidence of Edmund's lifelong deception. Pemberton's murder had been necessitated by his decision to reveal the true scope of the conspiracy, his mounting debts and fear of prosecution making him willing to betray his aristocratic clients in exchange for leniency, while Helena's medical expertise had provided her with both knowledge and tools necessary to weaken the bookshelf brackets with precisely applied beeswax, ensuring catastrophic failure at the crucial moment while her professional credentials placed her above suspicion. As Poirot's exposition reached its climax, the carefully maintained silence of the workshop seemed to press against the assembled company like a physical weight, broken only by the gentle ticking of timepieces that had witnessed the systematic destruction of their master's peace of mind, while Dr. Helena Ashford sat with aristocratic dignity, intact yet trembling on the edge of complete exposure. The gaslight flickered against the evening shadows as Hercule Poirot positioned himself at the center of Edmund Blackwood's workshop, his green eyes reflecting the satisfaction of a master craftsman who had finally assembled all components of an extraordinarily complex puzzle. Inspector Meadows stood near the doorway with barely concealed skepticism, still convinced that Marcus Whitfield's arrest had solved the case, while Iris Blackwood occupied her father's chair with pale composure that masked her growing horror at the revelations that had already shattered her understanding of recent events. Dr. Helena Ashford entered last, her aristocratic bearing intact despite the mounting pressure of the investigation, her steel-gray eyes surveying the assembled company with clinical detachment, though the little detective noted the almost imperceptible tremor in her gloved hands as she settled into the chair he had positioned with calculated precision. The workshop itself bore witness to Poirot's meticulous preparation, each piece of evidence arranged upon the central workbench with mathematical exactitude to create a visual timeline of deception that would guide his exposition through the complex mechanism of motive and method that had culminated in murder. The forged calendar fragments that had condemned an innocent man gleamed under the lamplight beside technical drawings that revealed their fraudulent nature, while the anonymous letters signed with the mysterious Initial A lay spread in chronological order to demonstrate the systematic psychological warfare that had driven Edmund Blackwood to his death. Most significantly, watermarked stationery bearing the distinctive A.S.A.D.A.N.B.O.Y.O. monogram occupied the center of this arrangement, its presence creating an atmosphere of expectation that made even the innocent feel exposed to scrutiny. Mesdames et messieurs, Poirot announced with formal precision, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty, "We gather this evening not merely to discuss the tragic deaths that have shaken Clockmaker's Row, but to examine the intricate machinery of justice and revenge that has operated in shadows for many months, driven by grievances that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances of these crimes." His methodical gaze settled upon Dr. Ashford with the intensity of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. "It is you, madame, who orchestrated this elaborate symphony of deception and death. You, Dr. Helena Ashford, are the author of Edmund Blackwood's torment and his ultimate demise, and the architect of James Pemberton's calculated murder." The sharp intake of breath from Inspector Meadows punctuated the sudden silence, while Iris's hands tightened upon the edge of the workbench as the full implications of this accusation struck her with devastating force. Helena's response revealed the steel beneath her genteel exterior, her medical training evident in the way she analyzed her situation with clinical detachment before choosing her strategy of defense. "Monsieur Poirot," she replied with controlled precision, "your imagination has constructed an elaborate fiction from circumstantial evidence that could equally support far simpler explanations for my presence in these tragic events." Yet Poirot's systematic demolition of her carefully constructed facade had only begun, his analysis of the technical evidence proving that only someone with intimate access to Edmund's workshop and detailed knowledge of precision mechanics could have created the forged calendar fragments that had condemned Marcus Whitfield. "Observe, if you will," he continued, lifting the moon disk with surgical precision. "This component bears a pressure angle that would bind any companion pinion, while these lathe chatter marks reveal work performed by hands less steady than those of Master Blackwood. When placed upon the velvet impression cut for the true prototype, it rocks imperceptibly, betraying its false parentage and confirming that someone with limited technical expertise created these pieces specifically to incriminate young Whitfield." The revelation of Helena's true identity struck the assembled company with the force of a physical blow, Poirot's gentle voice carrying inexorable authority as he exposed the generational grievance that had driven her decades-long campaign of retribution. "Your maiden name was Ashworth, was it not, madame? Inherited from your grandfather Augustus, the true inventor of the revolutionary perpetual calendar mechanism that brought fame and fortune to Edmund Blackwood, while its creator died in poverty and obscurity, his genius stolen by an opportunistic apprentice during their collaboration in Vienna decades ago. The watermarked stationery bearing the partial letters ASHW provided physical confirmation of this connection, while her obvious emotional investment in protecting what she called her family's honor revealed the depth of resentment that had transformed legitimate grievance into systematic murder. The scope of Helena's deception became apparent as Poirot methodically reconstructed her elaborate campaign of psychological warfare, the anonymous letters that had tormented Edmund in his final weeks, revealing themselves as products of a medical mind cloaked in mechanical metaphor. These missives, with their references to pathological degradation and systemic failure of ethical mechanisms, betray the clinical detachment of someone accustomed to diagnosing human frailties with scientific precision, he explained, spreading the correspondence with careful deliberation. Your weekly medical visits allowed you to monitor the clockmaker's declining mental state with the accuracy of a laboratory experiment, calibrating the pressure of your correspondence to exploit his cardiac condition while maintaining the facade of concerned physician attending a deteriorating patient. Dr. Ashford's composure showed its first visible crack when Poirot produced the most damning piece of evidence. a detailed medical journal she had maintained throughout Edmund's deterioration, documenting his cardiac responses to various stimuli with the dispassionate precision of a researcher conducting controlled experiments on human subjects. This journal, discovered among your private papers, reveals the systematic nature of your campaign, madame. Each entry records Edmund's increasing paranoia, his growing dependence on your medical consultations, and his desperate confessions about the calendar's questionable origins, all observed and recorded with the cold objectivity of someone who viewed his suffering as necessary data in a larger experiment. The method of murder itself demonstrated the sophisticated application of medical knowledge to criminal purpose. Helena's understanding of cardiac physiology, allowing her to orchestrate Edmund's death with precision that would appear natural to any subsequent investigation. During your final consultation, you administered a carefully calculated dose of cardiac stimulant, ensuring that the shock of discovering the theft would prove fatal to his already compromised heart. Poirot continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The thin line of blood found at the corner of his mouth was not the result of violence, but the predictable consequence of sudden cardiac failure in a patient whose condition you had been monitoring for months. Pemberton's murder had been necessitated by his decision to reveal the true scope of the conspiracy, his mounting debts and fear of prosecution making him willing to betray his aristocratic clients in exchange for leniency. The book dealer's death required different methods but equal precision, Poirot explained, demonstrating how Helena's medical expertise had provided her with knowledge of structural engineering sufficient to weaken the bookshelf brackets with precisely applied beeswax, ensuring catastrophic failure at the crucial moment while leaving no obvious evidence of sabotage. The deliberately dimmed gaslight, the planted decoy envelope, the manuscript positioned to suggest desperate searching, all calculated to create the appearance of tragic accident while concealing deliberate murder. As the weight of evidence mounted against her, Helena's aristocratic mask finally slipped to reveal the obsessive determination that had driven her decades-long campaign of retribution, her confession emerging not as capitulation, but as proud vindication of her grandfather's stolen genius and her own superior intellect. Augustus Ashworth was a visionary whose revolutionary designs were stolen by an opportunistic apprentice who built his entire reputation upon another man's brilliance, she declared with fierce pride, her voice carrying no trace of remorse, only the satisfaction of a mission accomplished through superior planning and execution. I have spent my adult life ensuring that justice was finally served, regardless of the methods required to achieve it. Her acknowledgement of the murders revealed the depth of resentment that had transformed legitimate grievance into systematic killing, while her contempt for those who had profited from her family's stolen legacy demonstrated the aristocratic arrogance that had made her believe herself above the conventional constraints of law and morality. As Inspector Meadows moved forward with handcuffs, Helena Ashford maintained her dignity to the end, her final words carrying both acknowledgement of defeat and warning that others who profited from stolen genius might face similar reckoning from those patient enough to wait for perfect justice. The little Belgian detective observed this conclusion with the mixed satisfaction and sadness that marked the resolution of his most complex cases, recognizing that while truth had been served, the human cost of Helena's elaborate revenge had far exceeded any reasonable measure of retribution for historical wrongs. The morning fog that had shrouded Clockmaker's Row began to lift as Dr. Helena Ashford was led away in handcuffs, her aristocratic composure maintained even as Inspector Meadows read the charges that would end her distinguished medical career. She offered no resistance to the cold metal clicking around her wrists, her steel-gray eyes sweeping across the assembled faces with clinical detachment rather than remorse. "The truth, Monsieur Poirot," she stated with clear resonance, "is rarely as simple as a constable's report. My grandfather's genius will now be acknowledged, and that, at least, represents justice." With that declaration, she allowed herself to be escorted to the police wagon, her back straight and step firm, disappearing into the London streets while leaving an indelible mark on all who had witnessed her methodical campaign of revenge, transformed into final defeat. Marcus Whitfield's release from custody brought complex emotions to the narrow street. The young man's obvious relief at vindication, tempered by the realization that his former employer's death had been orchestrated by someone whose weekly presence in the workshop had made her seem like family rather than enemy. Inspector Meadows, though initially chagrined by his fundamental misreading of the evidence, found himself grudgingly acknowledging the superiority of Poirot's psychological methods over conventional investigation. "I must admit, Monsieur Poirot," he conceded with reluctant admiration, "your approach to the subtle contradictions of human behavior has once again proven superior to my reliance upon physical evidence alone. Young Whitfield deserves both my apology and my assurance that such mistakes will not be repeated." The recovery of the stolen perpetual calendar from Helena's private residence, along with Augustus Ashworth's original technical drawings, created immediate questions about how to address Edmund Blackwood's tarnished reputation while honoring the true inventor's forgotten genius. Iris Blackwood, inheriting not only her father's workshop but also the terrible knowledge of his intellectual theft, faced decisions that would define both her personal future and her professional legacy. Her reunion with Marcus carried undertones of tragedy that transcended their romantic relationship, their embrace witnessed by neighbors who had spent days believing him guilty of murder, while the evidence of his innocence served only to emphasize the sophisticated malice that had nearly condemned him to execution for crimes he had never contemplated. Poirot observed with satisfaction as Iris made her first crucial decision regarding the workshop's future, announcing her intention to continue operating the business while acknowledging the complex truth about her father's greatest achievement. "The perpetual calendar will remain on display," she declared with quiet dignity, "but it will bear both names, Augustus Ashworth as inventor and Edmund Blackwood as developer, because truth serves justice better than comfortable lies." This decision demonstrated the kind of moral courage that could transform tragedy into meaningful legacy, recognizing that genius could err while theft did not erase legitimate skill, just as correction did not require complete humiliation of the deceased. The workshop itself began to resume its eternal rhythm as hundreds of timepieces continued their mechanical conversation, their gentle ticking marking the passage from chaos toward restored order. Marcus's request to return as an employee rather than heir reflected his understanding that trust, once broken by suspicion, required patient reconstruction through demonstrated competence rather than assumed privilege. Iris's cautious acceptance of his proposal, contingent upon proving himself through actual craftsmanship rather than romantic attachment, suggested the practical wisdom that would guide the establishment through its period of recovery and eventual renewal. Inspector Meadows's education in the limitations of purely mechanical approaches to criminal investigation would serve as valuable experience in future cases, though Poirot suspected that institutional inertia would prevent fundamental changes in Scotland Yard's investigative methods. The inspector's visit to learn from his mistakes, examining the subtle indicators he had overlooked, the undisturbed dust that contradicted forced entry, the glass fragments that revealed internal manipulation, the lavender traces that exposed planted evidence, demonstrated professional humility that offered hope for improved police work in complex psychological crimes. The broader implications of Helena's systematic campaign extended far beyond Clockmaker's Row to touch upon fundamental questions about inherited grievances and the responsibilities that accompany historical injustices across generations. Her medical training had provided both the knowledge and the detachment necessary to view human suffering as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of what she considered higher principles, while her aristocratic background had created the dangerous assumption that superior breeding entitled her to dispense justice according to personal standards rather than legal institutions. As evening settled over the narrow street and the workshop's mechanical symphony resumed its eternal conversation, Poirot reflected upon the intricate mechanism of human motivation that had transformed a quiet neighborhood into a battlefield where questions of intellectual property and professional honor had escalated into matters of life and death. The little detective understood that his resolution of the case had provided closure for the immediate participants, while leaving larger questions about justice and responsibility to be worked out through the slower mechanisms of social conscience and historical judgment. His departure from Clockmaker's Row would mark the end of active investigation, but not the conclusion of moral reckoning, as those who survived Helena Ashford's elaborate revenge would spend years determining how to honor legitimate grievances while preventing their transformation into systematic violence against the innocent. The perpetual calendar, object of so much ambition and deceit, would now serve as monument to both human genius and human frailty. Its precise mechanisms, marking time's passage while bearing witness to the complex relationships between inspiration, appropriation, and the eternal human struggle to balance justice with mercy in an imperfect world. The winter morning that settled over Clockmaker's Row 3 weeks after Dr. Helena Ashford's arrest carried with it the crisp clarity that follows the lifting of fog, both literal and metaphorical. Hercule Poirot stood at the window of Edmund Blackwood's workshop, his green eyes surveying the narrow street where ordinary life had begun to reassert itself over the extraordinary malice that had claimed 2 lives and nearly destroyed a 3rd. The little Belgian detective adjusted his perfectly waxed mustache with characteristic precision as he prepared for his departure, his investigation complete, but his reflections on human nature deepened by the complex mechanism of revenge and justice he had been called upon to dismantle. The perpetual calendar, restored to its place of honor in the workshop's display case, now bore a brass plaque that acknowledged both Augustus Ashworth as original inventor and Edmund Blackwood as developer, a compromise that honored genius while recognizing the painful complexities of intellectual inheritance in a world where inspiration and appropriation often walked hand in hand. Dr. Helena Ashford awaited trial in Holloway Prison with the composed dignity of a woman who had weighed the scales of conscience and found them balanced according to her own moral calculations, her aristocratic bearing intact despite the gray uniform and iron bars that now defined her existence. When Poirot visited her at the request of the Home Office, their conversation lasted precisely 7 minutes by his Geneva timepiece, a brief exchange that revealed the fundamental difference between justice and vengeance that had driven her elaborate campaign. "Do you believe justice has been served, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked with clinical interest, as if discussing a particularly complex medical case rather than her own fate. "Madame," he replied with gentle authority, "justice is like a clock with many trains of wheels. When one is forced beyond its proper tension, another inevitably slips from its intended rhythm." Her smile carried no trace of remorse, only the satisfaction of a mission accomplished through superior planning and execution, though she acknowledged his metaphor with the appreciation of one craftsman recognizing another's skill. Marcus Whitfield's exoneration brought relief tempered by the sobering recognition that his innocence had been preserved only through Poirot's intervention, the young man's gratitude expressed through renewed dedication to his craft, rather than dramatic declarations of loyalty or revenge. Inspector Meadows, initially chagrined by his fundamental misreading of the evidence, found himself grudgingly acknowledging the superiority of psychological observation over conventional investigation, his handshake with the freed apprentice carrying both apology and professional humility. The inspector's education in the limitations of purely physical evidence would serve him well in future cases, though Poirot suspected that institutional inertia would prevent fundamental changes in Scotland Yard's investigative methods, human nature being as resistant to alteration as the finest clockwork mechanism once properly adjusted. Iris Blackwood's decision to continue operating the workshop while acknowledging the complex truth about her father's greatest achievement demonstrated the kind of moral courage that could transform tragedy into meaningful legacy. Her choice to display both names on the calendar representing not weakness, but strength in facing uncomfortable realities. Her cautious acceptance of Marcus's return as employee rather than heir reflected practical wisdom gained through bitter experience, trust being like a delicate spring that required careful handling after being damaged by suspicion and betrayal. The young woman's composure, strengthened rather than broken by the revelations about her father's intellectual theft, suggested the resilience that would guide the establishment through its period of recovery and eventual renewal under her capable management. The broader implications of Helena's systematic campaign extended far beyond Clockmaker's Row, to touch upon fundamental questions about inherited grievances and the responsibilities that accompany historical injustices across generations, her medical training having provided both the knowledge and the detachment necessary to view human suffering as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of what she considered higher principles. The community itself had been irrevocably altered by the events, its residents now carrying the indelible awareness that even the most perfectly ordered lives could conceal profound disarray, while the gentle ticking of hundreds of timepieces served as constant reminder that time's passage neither erased past wrongs nor justified present violence in their correction. As Poirot prepared to enter the waiting hansom cab, he paused for a final survey of the workshop where his investigation had begun, noting with satisfaction that the mechanical symphony had resumed its eternal conversation, each timepiece contributing its voice to the collective measurement of moments that would outlast the human dramas played out in their presence. Inspector Meadows stepped forward to offer his farewell, promising to remember the lesson that footprints revealed not only where someone had walked, but whose shoes would choose to make such marks, a distinction that spoke to the psychological sophistication required for truly effective criminal investigation. The little detective's response carried characteristic wit. "Do not neglect the physical evidence, mon ami, but remember that the most important clues are often found not in what the criminal leaves behind, but in what they choose to take with them." The hansom cab rattled away from Clockmaker's Row as the afternoon light began to fade, carrying Poirot toward his next destination while leaving behind a community forever changed by his intervention. Through the window, he watched the narrow street recede into the London fog, its cobblestones cleaned by recent rain and its shop fronts straightening like penitents after confession. His final reflection on the case concerned not the technical brilliance of Helena's deception or the satisfaction of exposing her guilt, but the recognition that human hearts, with all their capacity for both creation and destruction, remained the most complex mechanisms he had ever encountered. "Time," he murmured to himself, as the cab clicked over the stones with mechanical precision, "is indeed an excellent judge, though sometimes a harsh one, but it has the virtue of being absolutely impartial, unlike we poor humans who must struggle with the imperfect machinery of conscience." With that philosophical observation, Hercule Poirot settled back against the leather seat, his small hands folded with characteristic precision, already turning his little gray cells toward the next puzzle that would require his unique understanding of the intricate clockwork that drives the human soul.